I heard about it like on the news.
I was a little stunned at first, but I liked that they're moving on to a different person.
And he's been in so many battles, millions and millions of battles this guy is in. This is how he dies.
One of my friends actually called me and told me, and I was in a class at the time, and I had to leave because I was like, wait, what?
He wasn't a superhero I really knew much about. He had like the flying saucer shield thingy. He liked America.
Yeah.
With the wounds of World War I barely healed, and another war on the horizon, Americans needed a catalyst to reinforce their traditional values.
Well, Captain America came on the scene in 1941 on the eve of America's entry into World War II. And of course, he was sort of a cheerleader, a morale booster, and brought a lot of attention to American entry, and was an incredibly patriotic figure that motivated a lot of people. And Captain America is one of the comics that's not just read by children, but adults and soldiers at the time.
Joe was a little smarter than the average writer or artist in the comic book industry at that time. He had more of an entrepreneurial spirit about him.
Then, aspiring artists Joe Simon and Jack Kirby came up with a symbol to embody those very same values.
I think he thought he was certainly bright enough and clever enough to come up with his own creation that could rival a Superman or Batman.
This creation would not only guide Americans through World War II, but would also become a constant reminder of what it is to be an American, even in the darkest times.
The design really caught people's eyes and had the benefit of two of the more experimental artists in the genre at the time, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby is legendary, and his design work continues to be influential in the comics today.
With Jack Kirby's innovative artwork and Joe Simon's creative sense of patriotism, they were able to create a character who would resonate with the American people. Steve Rogers, a man of below-average strength, was denied the right to fight for his country. He then became part of an experimental government program. This super soldier program would make Rogers reach the pinnacle of human conditioning. From there, he took on the persona of the superhero, Captain America.
The idea of a patriotic character, someone who on the cover of his first comic book is literally socking Adolf Hitler, had to seem to him as this has got to be, a hit.
The character itself wasn't the first character dressed in stars and stripes, but he was the most sort of popular.
His very first issue is famous around the world for Cap appearing on the cover punching out Adolf Hitler, which was very innovative and new at that time, because generally superheroes did not go into Germany and attack the Nazis.
He didn't have really any incredibly wildly fantastic superpowers. He was sort of based in the real world more than, say, Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four or Thor. And the fact that he could hold his own in the Avengers amongst, vastly more powerful, smarter characters was very significant and made people really enjoy this character.
Steve Rogers really was an everyman, much the same as Joe Higgins, who was the Shield, the first patriotic character.
Someone like Joe Simon represents a viewpoint of that these, in a way, should almost be somewhat like propaganda in the sense that they're being created to provide hope, positive role models, embodying the ideas and notions of what America can be, should be, etc.
That type of character, that archetype of character that character came to represent, the patriotic sort of jingoism of the period, and that as more and more Americans were getting concerned about what was going on in Europe and what was going on in Asia, that this became an expression, a legitimate expression of that feeling of we need to fight.
As the fighting abroad dwindled, it became increasingly difficult to find villains for Captain America to battle. So his popularity slowly declined to the point of near extinction in the 1950s.
In the 1960s, with the superhero revolution over at Marvel, Captain America was reintroduced in Avengers #4. He was found by the Avengers in a block of ice, and he then became a part of our modern world, which is pretty much the theme of Captain America from the 60s till now.
It wasn't until Joe Simon's departure that Stan Lee, the face of Marvel Comics, decided to rethink and reshape the entire Marvel universe. He and Jack Kirby embarked on the challenge of relaunching Captain America for a new generation.
Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with a very interesting angle on how to bring back Captain America, which was to make him literally a man out of time. Here's a character who was from this period of time being thrust into the turmoil of the 60s.
As a man out of time, as this Rip Van Winkle character, he sort of gives voice to this sense of being without purpose, unsure and unconfident in who he is and what he represents. So here's a man that's dressed in the flag, questioning what is his role.
All the other characters were sort of the contemporary characters that the kids reading comics in the 60s were all baby boomers, and they could relate to everyone. And taking someone like Captain America, who really was espousing the values of that generation's parents, and making that into a successful comic is one of the many things Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it was incredible that they could do it.
While Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's creative ideas kept the character relevant through the 60s, the increasing distrust of the government by Americans made it nearly impossible for a character who embodied that government to remain popular.
The 70s and 80s when I was reading a lot of superhero comics, and he was always a weird character because he had to be kind of this do-gooder, because he's Captain America, he's the ultimate patriot and served the government, but at the same time people are not as trusting as the government, like from when he was created in the 40s and World War II. That's the government was always right, and as we get older, 1984 kind of stories kind of happen, so we don't trust the government as much. So he's put in a weird position as a character.
So Captain America is being reintroduced into the United States marketplace at a time when Americans were less confident in their power as a global political force.
In the 70s, they went through a period of addressing the nation's cynicism and frustration with politics by having the character give up being Captain America for a while and becoming another character.
Steve Rogers becomes disillusioned with being Captain America and sheds the role.
When I was really invested in Captain America. They had replaced him temporarily with a different, like the government had replaced the Steve Rogers character with somebody else to take over as Captain America, and that guy ended up going insane.
For someone to come from that generation who, we all regard as the greatest generation, to sort of come amongst our midst and try to live a life in our modern world, whether it was the 80s, the 90s, now, I mean, there's a comic book where someone asked him, do you have a MySpace? And it was sort of a ridiculous question because it was meant to show that Captain America was out of touch with our times.
Through the late 80s, 1990s, up to 2000, the character is less successful, and likely because the character was born in conflict and really needs that conflict as part of the backdrop that he works against. So it isn't until 2001 that a real-world conflict is really present in American minds, and it can be injected into the background of the character.
That world conflict came in the form of a terrorist attack on the World Trade Towers on September 11, 2001.
Comics, I think, were reacting initially like pretty much the rest of the country. I mean, first, it was just incredible shock. They didn't know. I mean, it was as if, particularly for comic books, the irony is, it's as if something from out of the pages of a comic book had happened in real life.
Captain America found his place in the turmoil that unraveled after 9/11.
At the time of 9/11, certainly many comic books responded to it. You had a Spider-Man 9/11 story, you had other original stories about 9/11 and dedicated to the firemen and policemen and civilians that lost their lives there. And just like the rest of popular culture and entertainment, comic books have a sort of a new post-9/11 edge and an awareness of all things post-9/11.
And it was certainly no surprise that the country, and especially comic book creators, had a very basic primal reaction. It's as if they've been punched in the face. Well, they want to punch back.
The stories after September 11th kind of went through to try and reestablish characters as these larger-than-life and a good force, and some of the storylines kind of got simplified again because they wanted to again portray these characters as just basically good guys to show there's this force of humaneness in the world.
And Captain America has always been a tough one, and because of the patriotism inherent in the character, it's also very volatile. I mean, whatever you're doing with the character, if something like a world event like 9/11 or a war breaks out, that has a far more immediate impact on Captain America than probably any other character.
Through the stories after 9/11, Captain America makes a shift from a symbol of governmental power to a direct representation of the American people.
The longer the amount of time passed from 9/11, you began to see things change and alter, and comics reflecting various viewpoints.
The stories that were created after September 11th were much more complex than those stories that were written in World War II or in the early phases of the Cold War. So in that sense, it wasn't just here's the terrorist bad guys, but terrorism was now a prominent feature of the stories.
Sometimes the way to go about it is to shake everything up. Let's start all over. Let's take the basic premise and see if we could create some new excitement, and pull in a whole new audience. And I think that's what Marvel's done.
Within the Marvel universe, the destruction of an elementary school sparked a story that became an allegory to September 11th and the events that transpired.
The main event that really caused that was Civil War. It occurred because a bunch of superheroes happened to raid a house full of supervillains, and the fight spills over in Stamford, Connecticut to a public elementary school. And one of the villains, Nitro, his ability is to spontaneously explode. He's set off, and the explosion kills a few hundred members of Stanford, including a whole bunch of students. And so the public outcry leads to the Superhero Registration Act, which the government passes, and the first person they asked to enforce that act, to bring in the unregistered and those unwilling to register, is Captain America. And he says, no, this is against our civil liberties, and so he fights it.
All of the Marvel comic books in the whole Marvel universe went through what was called Civil War, and they were forced to either sort of unmask and become government agents or go rogue. And Captain America went rogue. He did not believe in revealing identities, and that's what led to his death.
The Civil War was a direct result of the Superhero Registration Act. One side, led by Captain America, believed in individual liberties. The opposition, fronted by Iron Man, deemed national security more important, but at the cost of those very same civil liberties.
Because the character had evolved to such a point where he was the living embodiment of American ideals, any action by the government, symbolic action which would put restrictions on that ideal, on those ideals, would put restrictions on liberty, was an anathema to him.
The person who does take up the pro-registration side is Iron Man, who has been an ally who found Captain America in that block of ice all those years ago. So the whole conflict is about what's right, what is the right thing to do. When you have such incredible power, is it right to sort of follow the law, be with the government, or to really fight for the true spirit of what this country is?
So the Civil War was an organic outgrowth of character development, in my point of view. That you have somebody who is fundamentally committed to liberty and the individual, and then you have somebody who is fundamentally committed to maintaining security. So when confronted with terrorism, or at least its analog, they are going to respond according to their philosophical framework.
Ultimately, at the end, he saw that he was causing a big path of destruction, and Captain America stands down, he's arrested, he goes to stand trial, and out of nowhere, an assassin is about to shoot a police officer guarding Captain America. He pushes him out of the way and gets shot in the shoulder. There's a big ruckus in the crowd, and he gets shot in the stomach a few times, and he dies on the steps of the courtyard.
The whole death of Captain America, I think, is a combination of two things. One, reflecting on just the viability of the character as he was before they decided to kill him, from a commercial standpoint, and two, just creatively rethinking the character. You know, we've gone this far with the character as he was. How can we reposition him today to make him more viable?
His old partner from World War II, Bucky, has miraculously survived the decades, even though we didn't know it until recently. And he's now carrying the shield of Captain America and doing a pretty fine job.
It's imposing a lot of responsibility onto someone to live up to it. In a sense, it's like even becoming more than the President of the United States. You're becoming the living embodiment of everything that's good and what America stands for.
Since Steve Rogers is dead, his partner, who has been revealed to have been alive this whole time, takes up the mantle of Captain America and becomes the new symbol of hope and freedom that Steve Rogers was, and with his passing can't be anymore. So we have a new Captain America, and he's not as perfect as Steve Rogers may have seemed, but he's doing the best he can, and it's a very gripping and very good story.
When they brought back Bucky, they did not choose to, dress him in the traditional costume. They created a new costume for him, but the blackness of it can, symbolically represent that we're in a darker place. The gun is an emblem of some of our more violent tendencies. And so there is this, sense of enduring hope that one soldier might fall in the battle, but that the war will continue, and hopefully, good will triumph over evil.
Captain America has always been tied in to this country, its beliefs, its ideals, and as the audience changes, as the world changes, as the people of America change and their perceptions of what America is or isn't change, it puts the creators of the comic in a difficult spot.
I think the United States needs a flag waver. Somebody like Captain America who can embody American ideals and take us into the next administration and continue taking us into the 21st century.
With Steve Rogers now gone and Bucky Barnes assuming the persona of Captain America, Americans are left looking for answers. What does it mean to be an American? And what does someone who is draped in the flag now symbolize?
Comic books are a very legitimate art form, and they've reached a tremendously high level at this time in terms of the richness and the character, substance. It's like any other art form, be it music, painting, what have you. It's by no means just simply entertainment.
The comics community, different than however you want to say a high art or fine art community, are very passionate. They care intensely about the characters, about the books themselves, and about the creators and the people involved with it. There's not this layer remove or trying to play it cool. And that's one of the wonderful things about comics. It's the way they tell stories. As I was saying, it's very visceral and very on the surface, and that's their wonder and their strength.
From inception, it was entertainment for children, largely, whereas now it's far more an art form that reflects life. Current events, just like any other art form.
Comics are fortunately back in an expanding mode, and I think there are more and more kids today discovering comics, far more girls reading comics now than maybe just 10 years ago. So it's an exciting time to be in comics.
And sales of Captain America have been excellent, and I'd have to say, my personal opinion, It's probably the best book about a main character who's dead that's ever been written.